History of campaign finance regulation. Campaign finance regulation has a long history in the United States, beginning even before independence was gained from Great Britain. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, efforts focused on protecting employees and union members from being coerced into contributing to political campaigns in order to keep their jobs. The landscape of CFR changed dramatically in the 1970s with the passing of the Federal Election Campaign Act, which created the framework for all current regulations regarding contribution limits and reporting. This act also gave rise to the Federal Elections Commission, or FEC, which is responsible for overseeing and enforcing campaign finance. In recent years, several lawsuits such as Citizens United versus FEC and McCutcheon versus FEC have challenged the constitutionality of the FEC laws. Pre-Federal Elections Campaign Act. In 1757, after George Washington bought $195 worth of punch and hard cider for friends prior to an election, the legislature passed a law prohibiting candidates or persons on their behalf from giving voters money, meat, drink, entertainment, or provision, any present, gift, reward, or entertainment, etc., in order to be elected. In 1867, Congress passed a naval appropriations bill that made it illegal for government officials to solicit naval yard workers for money. This marked the first time the federal government specifically tried to regulate campaign finance. 1883, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was passed, making it illegal for government officials to solicit contributions from any civil service workers or award these positions on anything but merit. Prior to this act, many people who worked in government positions were expected to make contributions in order to keep their jobs. 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt called for vigorous measures to eradicate perceived political corruption and suggested that contributions by corporations to any political committee or for any political purpose should be forbidden by law. 1907, the Tillman Act was passed, making contributions to federal candidates by corporations and national banks illegal. The act was relatively ineffective, however, as there was not a good way to enforce it. 1910, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act was passed, which required House candidates to disclose their finances. 1 year later, Senate and primary candidates were required to disclose their finances, and expenditure limits were set for all congressional candidates. 1921, in Newberry versus United States, the Supreme Court rules that the Federal Corrupt Practices Act is unconstitutional because the Constitution does not grant Congress the authority to regulate political parties or federal primary elections. As a result, spending limits were not longer required in congressional elections. 1925, Congress amends the Federal Corrupt Practices Act to include a ban on any corporation contribution to a federal campaign. Candidates must disclose the source of contribution greater than $50. Patronage is prohibited, and Senate candidates can spend 3 cents for each voter based on the previous election, up to $25,000. House candidates are limited to $5,000. 1935, the Public Utilities Holding Act is passed, prohibiting public utility companies from contributing to federal campaigns. 1939, the Hatch Act is passed, which bans most federal employees from contributing to candidates in national elections and from participating in political activities or campaigns. 1943, the Smith-Connolly Act is passed, which prohibited unions from contributing to federal candidates. Prior to this law, unions had been using dues as political donations. The first Political Action Committee is established by the Congress of Industrial Organization, and union members voluntarily contribute to the PAC independent of the union. 1947, The Taft-Hartley Act is passed, which banned corporations and unions from even making independent expenditures in federal political campaigns, as long as candidates promised not to use their primary money during the general election campaign or collect private donations. They could campaign with publicly funded dollars. 1967. Congress officially begins to collect campaign finance reports, despite it being law for nearly 50 years. Federal Election Campaign Act, 1971 election laws. The Federal Election Campaign Act, FECA, of 1971 and the 1971 Revenue Act were passed, initiating fundamental changes in campaign finance laws. FECA required full reporting of campaign contributions and expenditures and also limited spending on media advertisements. In addition, FECA provided the legislative framework for PACs established by unions and corporations, which allowed unions and corporations to use treasury funds to establish, operate, and solicit voluntary contributions for the PAC to be used in federal races. The Revenue Act allowed citizens to check a box on their tax forms, authorizing the federal government to use one of their tax dollars to finance presidential campaigns in the general election. From the time this was first implemented in 1973, enough money had been collected to fund the 1976 election. The Clerk of the House, the Secretary of the Senate, and the Comptroller General of the General Accounting Office monitored and enforced FECA, while the Justice Department was responsible for prosecuting violations. Amendments. Following the documentation of campaign abuses in the 1972 elections, the Federal Election Commission was established and given jurisdiction in civil enforcement, authority to write regulations, and responsibility for monitoring compliance with FECA. The President, Speaker of the House, and President pro tempore of the Senate were each allowed to appoint 2 voting members of the Commission, and the Secretary of the Senate and Clerk of the House were designated as non-voting commissioners. The 1974 amendments also provided for partial federal funding in the form of matching funds for presidential primary candidates. Public funding was also extended to political parties to finance their presidential nominating conventions. Congress also enacted strict limits on both contributions and expenditures for all federal candidates and political committees involved in federal elections. Buckley versus Valeo. Portions of the 1974 amendments were challenged as unconstitutional, and a lawsuit was filed by Senator James L. Buckley against the Secretary of the Senate, Francis R. Valeo. The court upheld contribution limits, but overturned expenditure limits, saying that limiting expenditures would limit the quantity of campaign speech, which in turn violated First Amendment rights. In addition, provisions of the law regarding public funding, disclosure, and record keeping were upheld. The court also found that the method of appointing members to the FEC violated the principle of separation of powers. 1976 amendments. In response to the court's ruling, Congress repealed the expenditure limits and revised the method of appointing commissioners. Beginning in 1976, the President appointed 6 commissioners to be confirmed by the Senate. These amendments also included provisions to limit the scope of PAC fundraising by corporations and labor organizations by specifying who could be solicited for contributions and how those solicitations could be conducted. In addition, a single contribution limit was adopted for all PACs established by the same union or corporation. 1979 amendments. Following the 1976 and 1978 elections, Congress further amended the law to include provisions to simplify reporting requirements, encourage party activity at state and local levels, and increase public funding grants for presidential nominating conventions. Post-Federal Elections Campaign Act, 1990. The Supreme Court ruled on Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce, stating that Michigan's law banning corporations from using company money for independent expenditures was constitutional. 1992, President George H.W. Bush vetoed a bill that sought to provide partial public financing for congressional candidates. 2002, the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BCRA, was passed, which sought to limit the use of soft money. Soft money is money raised by national parties and political action committees for get out the vote campaign efforts and other organization building activities. This money wasn't regulated by the federal government, and parties were raising unlimited funds for these activities, but using them for purposes aside from voter registration. Notably, 501c and 527 organizations were exempted from the soft money ban, although they were banned from running ads prior to primaries and elections and from providing direct advocacy for a candidate. 2003, the BCRA was sent to the Supreme Court via suits filed by Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell, the California Democratic Party, and National Rifle Association under the complaint that the law was too broad and limited their First Amendment rights. The court upheld the law in McConnell versus the Federal Election Commission. 2006, the Supreme Court ruled Vermont's strict caps on campaign contributions unconstitutional in Randall versus Sorrell, saying it violated the First Amendment. 2007, the Supreme Court reversed their position on issue ads in McConnell versus Federal Election Commission and Federal Election Commission versus Wisconsin Right to Life, Inc., saying that limits on electioneering spending by nonprofits were unconstitutional. 2008, Senator Barack Obama became the first presidential candidate from a major party not to take public financing for the general election, citing a broken system for his actions. Citizens United and McCutcheon, 2010. In Citizens United versus FEC, the Supreme Court held that independent expenditures by corporations and labor unions were protected by the First Amendment, which struck down BCRA provisions that banned these types of expenditures. A few months later, the decision from Citizens United was applied to SpeechNow.org versus FEC in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Judges decided arguments that unlimited independent expenditures would lead to corruption were invalid after the Citizens United decision. 2012, for the first time, both presidential candidates did not accept public financing. Also, the Supreme Court decided that Citizens United applied to Montana's 1912 legislation banning direct corporate political spending in American Tradition Partnership versus Bullock. 2014, the recent Supreme Court decision in McCutcheon versus FEC ruled that aggregate contribution limits infringed on First Amendment rights. This decision removes a cap on the amount of money any single donor, including PACs, can give to candidates or party committees. Previously, the limit had been a total of $48,600 every 2 years for all federal candidates and an aggregate of $74,600 to political parties and committees. There is no limit to the number of PACs that can exist, so donors could theoretically increase their contributions to certain candidates considerably if they had enough PACs supporting them. The base limits for campaign contributions of $2,600 for individual candidates and $5,000 for PACs remain in effect. Efforts to overturn Supreme Court decisions. Many state legislatures across the country have put forward measures to form committees to review the ruling and call on the United States Congress for a constitutional amendment that would overturn Citizens United versus FEC and McCutcheon versus FEC. While much of the legislation has not moved forward, some states, such as Illinois, have had such legislation passed by both houses of the state legislature. The following are examples of legislative attempts. Arizona HCR 2026 of the 51st Legislature. Illinois SJR 27 of the 98th Regular Session. New Jersey ACR of the 216th Legislature. New Hampshire SB 307 of the 2014 Legislative Session. Nebraska LR 23 of the 103rd Legislature. Organ SJM 9 of the 2013 regular session. Additionally, various organizations have campaigned for similar constitutional amendments to reform campaign finance. A call for the New Hampshire Senate to pass House Concurrent Resolution 2 calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission from Public Citizen.